In the 53rd year of his watching, when his hands had stopped holding warmth and the stone beneath him felt like the only solid thing left in the world, he pressed his fingers into the wet clay one final time. The priests would not understand what he left them, they rarely did. But the water was already moving beneath the earth. He could feel it the way he had once felt the pull of distance between stars, and there was no one left who spoke what he spoke, no one left to translate urgency into a language that would survive. So he pressed the marks. Outside, Shuruppak slept. I found them because I was trying to understand something else entirely. I had been working through the secondary literature on Mesopotamian temple architecture, the proportions of the early dynastic ziggurats, the way certain ritual spaces seemed sized for a liturgy nobody had fully reconstructed, when I kept running into the same set of tablets. Not as the subject of the papers I was reading, but in footnotes, references to the Eridu Genesis, to the Atrahasis Epic, to a fragmentary text from Nippur that scholars kept citing and then stepping carefully around. The footnotes all pointed to the same thing. The Sumerians remembered a flood, they remembered a warning, and they remembered that the warning came from above. Let me explain what Sumer actually was, because the word carries too much mythology and not enough geography. Eridu is the oldest city in the Sumerian record, not in legend, but in the archaeological record, its foundation layers dating to approximately 5400 BCE, sitting in what is now southern Iraq near the ancient shoreline of the Persian Gulf. The Sumerians believed Eridu was the first city the gods built after civilization descended from the sky. For a long time that belief seemed like cosmology. Then the excavations began, and the city was here, and its occupation layers went down farther than anyone had expected. The Sumerian king list is a document, copied across multiple clay tablets, now held in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford and the Iraq Museum in Baghdad, that records the names and reigns of Sumerian kings from the very beginning of civilization to the scribes' own present. The early entries are impossible. Alulim of Eridu reigned for 28,800 years, Al-Jar for 36,000. 8 antediluvian kings across 5 cities accumulated a combined reign of 241,200 years. The list moves through these figures in the same flat administrative tone it uses for everything else, until it reaches a single phrase that sits like a wall in the middle of the document. Then the flood swept over. After that line, the rains dropped to human scale. Decades, occasionally a century, never again thousands of years. Whatever the scribes believed they were recording, they understood that something fundamental had broken, that the world before the flood and the world after it were not the same kind of world. Shuruppak appears in the king list as the last antediluvian city. It has been excavated, its occupation layers have been documented, its material culture analysed, and at Shuruppak archaeologists found what they had not entirely expected: a uniform sediment layer approximately 1 metre thick, interrupting the continuous record of the city's habitation with a single clean break. Dated to approximately 2900 BCE, composed of water-borne silt. Below it is one city. Above it is another. The break is not gradual. It does not suggest slow abandonment and resettlement. It suggests something that happened fast. The Sumerian flood traditions all name Shuruppak as the city where the warning was received. The Eridu Genesis, preserved in fragmentary form, dated to approximately 1600 BCE, but drawing on sources already centuries older, names Ziusudri, a king priest of Shuruppak, as the man who was told what was coming. The Atrahasis Epic, composed around 1700 BCE and now held in the British Museum, tells the same story with more institutional detail. A council of sky beings deliberated over humanity's fate. A decision was made, and one member of that council violated the decision by sending a warning through the walls of a reed house to a single sleeping man inside. The instruction was not vague. It described dimensions, materials, provisions, and the number of days before the water came. It read less like a divine proclamation and more like a technical briefing delivered under constraint quickly through an indirect channel to someone who might not understand what he was being told in time to act. What was the channel exactly? The name the Atrahasis gives to the being who sent the warning is Enki. The Sumerians knew him as one of the Anunnaki, the sky beings, the ones whose counsel had governed the world before the flood. The Anunnaki are not fringe material. They appear in the earliest Sumerian religious texts, in temple hymns, in administrative records from Ur. What is unusual about Enki and the Atrahasis is not that he warned a human being. What is unusual is that he was not supposed to. 1838, the water came. Shuruppak disappeared beneath a metre of silt. The Atrahasis Epic is explicit about what preceded it. Enlil, the chief of the Anunnaki Council, the sky being whose authority governed the assembled gods, had called a deliberation. Humanity had become, in the text's precise phrasing, too loud. The word carries overtones of disorder, of a civilization that had grown beyond what the sky beings had designed it to be. Enlil's conclusion was not gradual. The flood was a decision made in council, recorded in the same administrative tone the Sumerians used for grain allocations and labour assignments. It was institutional. It was ratified. It was supposed to be kept from the people it concerned. Enki dissented, not publicly, but through an indirect channel, through the wall of a reed house, speaking to a sleeping man in a way that could be understood as wind, as dream, as anything other than what it was. The warning in the Atrahasis is not a prophecy. It is an instruction set. Specific dimensions for a vessel, specific provisions, a specific count of days before the water arrived. That precision does not belong to the grammar of divine proclamation. It belongs to someone who understood the mathematics of what was coming and needed to transmit them accurately under conditions that made accuracy nearly impossible. This is the figure I keep returning to. Not Enlil, who made the decision, not Ziusudra, who survived, but the one who sent the warning from a position already compromised, already separated, the Atrahasis implies, from the council whose choice he was violating. Old, in whatever sense that word applied to beings, the Sumerians measured in tens of thousands of years, alone, at the end of something, pressing the message through the only channel still open. The priests at Shuruppak, who received and copied the traditions around Ziusudra, were not ignorant men. They were temple scribes, trained in cuneiform, responsible for the most sophisticated administrative apparatus in the ancient world. When the warning arrived, through ritual form, through the existing channels of religious communication that Enki would have known how to use, they recorded it because it arrived dressed in the language of divine instruction. They did not recognize it as the final act of a being working against his own kind. They recognized it as a god speaking. So they copied it carefully, filed it in the temple archive, and returned to the work of a city that had perhaps 2 weeks left. And here is the timeline as it actually stands. The sediment layer at Shuruppak was 2900 BCE. The break in the king list, the flood swept over. The Ziusudra tradition in the Eridu Genesis was copied 1600 BCE from sources centuries older. The Atrahasis Epic was composed 1700 BCE, recovered in 3 tablets from Nineveh in the British Museum. Tablet 11 of the Epic of Gilgamesh was inscribed 700 BCE, identified by George Smith in 1872. The Nippur tablets containing the Eridu Genesis were excavated in the 1890s, fragments now split between Philadelphia and Istanbul. 2,000 years of copying, 5,000 years of survival, one flood. What none of this answers is why later civilizations remembered the event as divine judgment, rather than as a warning that failed to reach everyone in time. The distinction matters. A god who punishes is one kind of story. A being who violated his own council's decision, who pressed the message through a wall in the dark, who was dying by the time the water arrived, is a different kind of story entirely. The first story requires submission. The second requires something harder, the recognition that someone from above saw what was coming and chose at the very end to tell us anyway. The tablets are still there. The Atrahasis is in the British Museum. The Eridu Genesis is at the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology. The sediment layer at Shuruppak is documented in the published reports of the Deutsche Orient-Gesellschaft, available to anyone who looks. The archive has been accessible for over a century, and somewhere in those damaged, carefully copied 5,000-year-old surfaces in the gaps between the fragments, in the lines the copyists preserved without understanding what they were preserving. The last warning is still waiting. Pressed into clay before the water came exactly as it was left, by a hand that knew what was coming and had no more time than it took to write it down. What did the final line say?